The calendar year is 1913. A distinguished senator stands in front of Congress and delivers a solemn guarantee. The newly proposed tax on income will absolutely never affect the everyday American citizen. It is designed to target exclusively the outrageously wealthy elite. The maximum rate will never surpass a tiny percentage. Above all, it is strictly an interim measure. Every single syllable of that grand assurance was an utter fabrication. This happened not by tragic accident, but by calculated architecture. The majority of the public still assumes the income tax was an unavoidable legislative reform. They view it as a necessary correction to the severe financial gluttony of the Gilded Age, acting as a righteous tool to compel millionaires to finally pay their equitable share. Yet, here is the unvarnished reality of what actually unfolded over time. An initiative that initially launched as a microscopic 1% levy aimed exclusively at the uppermost 3% of national earners has successfully extracted an astonishing sum estimated at roughly $50 trillion directly out of the American commercial engine throughout the preceding century. The underlying apparatus that facilitated this colossal financial extraction was completely obscured in plain sight from the very first day. The genuine historical inquiry is not simply how a supposedly fleeting financial levy transformed into a permanent fixture. The much deeper question is whether this policy was genuinely intended to possess an expiration date at all. It represents the greatest legislative bait-and-switch scheme in American history. To fully grasp what 1913 truly represented, you must first understand the exact facade it was dressed up to resemble. The 16th Amendment was formally ratified on February 3, 1913. Its complete textual content is strikingly brief. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. It is a mere 23 words. It features absolutely zero statutory caps on allowable rates. It contains zero sunset clauses to force an end date. It provides zero definitional boundaries for what constitutes income. And it sets no ultimate limit on what the legislative branch could eventually choose to siphon. The politicians who physically penned this language possessed a crystalline understanding of exactly what they were building. Meanwhile, the individuals tasked with pitching this monumental shift to the voting public spun an entirely contradictory narrative. States Senator Elihu Root of New York, widely recognized as one of the preeminent legal intellects of his generation, issued a dire caution in 1909. He vehemently warned that passing this constitutional alteration would essentially be handing the federal government an unlimited blank check devoid of any functional expiration date. His prescient warnings were completely brushed aside. Instead, the general populace was bombarded with reassurances from the progressive faction, who swore that the collection would solely target households pulling in excess of $3.00 annually, a sum equivalent to approximately $90 when adjusted for modern inflation. During the initial rollout in 1913, this generous threshold effectively shielded roughly 97% of the entire American demographic from contributing even a solitary penny. Only an exceptionally minute fraction, approximately 358, citizens were required to submit filing documentation during that inaugural cycle, drawn from a sweeping national population of nearly 97 million individuals. The absolute highest bracket was capped at 7%, and that specific rate was exclusively triggered by astronomical earnings surpassing the $500 mark, which translates to a towering $15 million fortune in today's economic climate. Herein lies the precise mechanical nature of the grand deception. You simply cannot successfully market a permanent, ever-expanding governmental revenue framework by broadcasting the draconian endgame. You exclusively sell the introductory phase. You deliberately engineer the entry point to appear entirely painless. You cloak it in a mantle of moral righteousness. You ensure that it feels virtually indistinguishable from pure societal justice. The reformist crusade of the early 20th century had successfully dedicated an entire decade to cultivating a fierce public outrage directed squarely at the colossal titans of industry. These were financial giants like Rommel, J.P. Morgan, and Henry Ford, men whose accumulated riches were so astronomically immense that they appeared to inhabit a completely different, untouchable universe. The taxation of earnings was aggressively promoted as the ultimate weapon for their financial reckoning. Consequently, the ordinary American citizen did not merely feel personally insulated from the new law. They actively applauded its implementation. This represents the absolute oldest psychological maneuver in the recorded history of state extraction. You dump the initial financial burden squarely upon the shoulders of a specific demographic that the broader public actively resents. And subsequently, you stealthily widen the mechanical net to eventually ensnare absolutely everybody else, but only after the permanent legal foundation has been fully cemented into place. The British Empire ran this exact same strategic playbook over a century earlier. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger introduced a temporary, targeted 10% levy on wealthy property owners in 1799, pitching it as a purely temporary, desperate measure to finance the ongoing military struggles against Napoleon's forces. It was designed to be politically frictionless and economically justified by the sheer existential threat of war. However, the moment the collection mechanism was established, successive parliamentary leaders steadily expanded its parameters until it evolved into a permanent, inescapable reality touching everyday commerce and standard civilian wages. The outcries of the heavily burdened public were deafening. Yet absolutely nothing was reversed. The historical precedent was firmly established. In 1913, the United States Congress constructed the exact same self-perpetuating machine. They simply managed to wrap it in infinitely superior public relations campaigns. Prominent legislative figures actively poured fuel onto these reassurances. Senator William Borah of Idaho, a highly vocal champion of the amendment's passage, openly declared to the press that a microscopic rate of just 2% would prove to be entirely sufficient for funding all federal operations. He confidently proclaimed that the rates would absolutely never breach this trivial threshold under standard, peacetime conditions. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan aggressively pacified the nervous nation by insisting that the extraction was laser-focused entirely upon citizens whose personal revenues were so monumentally massive that they could effortlessly absorb any conceivable financial burden. The Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, famously dismissed the legislation as a profoundly trivial burden upon middle-class Americans. Now, none of these esteemed gentlemen were engaging in malicious perjury in the traditional sense. They sincerely believed what was politically advantageous to articulate at that specific moment. Their catastrophic misjudgment was rooted in something vastly more fundamental than simple dishonesty. Their error lay in the remarkably naive conviction that a formalized constitutional surrender of boundless taxing authority would only ever be utilized to the exact degree that currently felt socially appropriate. The entirety of recorded history has not produced a single example of a sovereign government that, once officially granted the legal permission to extract wealth, taxed its citizens less aggressively over time than it did at the beginning. Not a single occurrence. The ultimate trajectory of movement, the second the bureaucratic machinery is bolted to the floor, is perpetually identical. The mechanical ratchet only ever clicks in a single direction. The calendar year that fundamentally rewired everything actually struck twice. Here is the immensely critical detail that virtually no mainstream historian ever discusses. And the moment you recognize its presence, you will never be capable of unseeing it. The 16th Amendment secured its complete ratification in February of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was officially signed into binding law in December of 1913. Both world-altering events occurred within the exact same calendar cycle. Both were forcefully propelled by a heavily overlapping coalition of dominant political factions. The symbiotic relationship existing between these two monumental pillars is absolutely not a random coincidence. It is deeply causal. Consider with precision what functional purpose each institution actually serves. The income tax provides the federal government with a direct, endlessly scalable legal claim upon the future financial earnings of every single American citizen. Simultaneously, the Federal Reserve provides that exact same federal authority with the extraordinary capacity to freely spend vast mountains of capital that it does not currently possess. It achieves this by literally conjuring the money into existence out of thin air, lending it into the physical economy, and subsequently leveraging the future projected tax revenues of the populace as the implicit collateral backing for that newly generated debt. These two colossal financial systems were strictly not conceptualized in a vacuum. They were deliberately engineered as a tandem pair. Frank Chodorow, penning his thoughts in 1954 within his seminal text The Income Tax Root of All Evil, formulated a rigorous argument that has genuinely never faced a proper refutation. Prior to 1913, the federal government was severely constrained into financing its existence almost entirely through a combination of foreign raid tariffs and domestic excise taxes. These traditional revenue streams possessed a hard, natural ceiling. They were highly visible. They impacted daily commerce in a direct manner. Consequently, they triggered instantaneous economic and political pushback whenever nudged upward. Crucially, there existed absolutely no mechanism for the central state to forcefully reach into a worker's wage packet and extract a predetermined percentage before that individual ever touched their own earnings. The income tax violently shattered that historical constraint entirely. The subsequent birth of the Federal Reserve, arriving a mere 10 months later, perfectly completed the electrical circuit. From that moment forward, the governmental apparatus was completely free to spend astronomically beyond its actual current revenue streams by continuously borrowing from the newly minted central banking authority, and it could seamlessly utilize the newly instituted income tax as the ultimate guarantee that all future borrowing would absolutely be repaid. The two monumental institutions rendered each other absolutely mandatory. In the total absence of the power to tax incomes, the lofty promises and printed notes of the Federal Reserve would have been structurally void and entirely weightless. Conversely, in the total absence of the Federal Reserve's endless money spigot, the income tax alone would have severely throttled federal spending to merely what could be practically collected from the citizenry in real time.